Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Actual Tech Media Expert Series. Today's topic is Rethinking Cloud Steps for Refocusing on Business Outcomes rather than IT Requirements. A fantastic topic that I am really excited to be discussing today. My name is Keith Ward. I'm with Actual Tech Media, and I'm thrilled to be your moderator for this special event that is so important these days. But before we get to today's content, we do have a few housekeeping items I need to let you know about so you can get the most out of this event. First off, we want your questions. Send them via the questions box in your webinar control panel. At the end of the presentation, I will be joining our expert for some Q&A. Now, that Q&A panel is also the place to just say hello, which a lot of you have been doing already. Love to see where you're logging in from, so keep that coming as well. Now, that Q&A panel is also the place to let us know what we can do to help if you have any technical issues. First thing you want to do if that happens, if something goes sideways, is to do a browser refresh, which should fix most of your problems. If that doesn't work, let us know in that Q&A. We'll try to help you out further. All right. Next, check out the handouts section where you will find links to content from each of today's sponsors. There also you'll find Actual Tech Media links, including one to the Gorilla Guide Book Club, where you can get access to our great printed resources on technology topics. There's also a link to the Actual Tech Media Events Center, which has our calendar of upcoming events, including some juicy ones. So check those out and sign up after the event if you see something you like. And lastly, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $250 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Now, you do have to be in attendance during the entire live event to qualify for the prize. The official terms and conditions of the prize drawing can be found in the handouts section if you like really dry reading. Okay. Now, these expert series events are special product neutral looks at pressing technology problems presented by our expert. But the support of our sponsors is what makes it possible for us to bring you this content. So we want to give a special shout out to them today. And I'm going to go over some slides with some information about each of them. And that our sponsors today are Rubric, Do It, and Cisco Duo. So let's get into a little bit more about each of these sponsors. Let's start with Rubric. Did you know that by 2025, the cybercrime business will be worth $10 trillion, making it the third largest economy in the world? Yeah. So to fight back, you need a way to secure your data, monitor for data risks, and quickly recover your data no matter where it lives. Rubric helps you achieve business resilience against cyber attacks, malicious insiders, and operational disruptions. They secure your data wherever it lives, across enterprise, cloud, and SaaS, making your business unstoppable. Today's event is also sponsored by Do It. Now, Do It provides intelligent technology to simplify and automate public cloud use alongside expert consultancy and unlimited technical support for digitally savvy companies. And hopefully that's you. Do It is an award-winning strategic partner of Google Cloud and AWS. And Do It also operates in more than 70 countries worldwide. And finally, today's event is brought to you by Cisco Duo. They offer a robust and user-friendly multi-factor authentication solution that enhances cybersecurity for individuals and organizations. With Duo, users can secure their accounts by combining something they know, like a password, with something they have, like a smartphone or a token. This added layer of protection significantly reduces the risk of unauthorized access, protecting sensitive data, and ensuring a more resilient security posture in an increasingly digital world. And with that, folks, why don't we get to today's outstanding content? And I am sure that is going to be that because our presenter is the great Joey D'Antoni. Joey is a principal consultant with Denny Cherry and Associates. His knowledge base is wide and deep, and he is just steeped in all of this stuff, works with it every day, and has so much knowledge. I am truly excited to have him with us. I'm going to turn it over to Joey right now. And as I mentioned earlier, I will be hopping on when he is wrapped up at the end for some Q&A. So Joey, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Expert Series. I'm Joey D'Antoni, and you're in Rethinking Cloud, Steps for Refocusing on Business Outcomes Rather than IT Requirements. I feel like the world has changed a lot in the last decade, and I specifically call it the last decade because I really think to 2013 as to when cloud maturity started to reach a level where it became acceptable for most business. That was the year Microsoft went general availability on Azure virtual machines, which was really a big step in popularizing the cloud amongst enterprises. AWS had already had somewhat of a groundhold, especially with some of their early services like S3 and EC2, which is their virtualization, but it took a while. Over that time, we saw a lot of organizations go all in on the cloud, sometimes intelligently, sometimes not. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. You might not need to be the organization that completely repatriates all of your cloud assets into an on-premises data center. However, you want to have the understanding of the business needs and the value proposition that the cloud is providing for you, both strategically and financially. It's not just a financial decision, but of course, everything does come down to some financial analysis. We'll also talk about where you can derive the most benefit and how you can do that. So to our earlier point, I think we saw a time, and I'm going to say from 2016 to 2022, because I'm a principal consultant in a cloud partner firm. So I see a lot of cloud migrations. I've executed a lot of cloud migrations. I've planned the architecture. I've done the moves. So I've kind of been on all sides of this. And it's something that is really complicated to do it right. And there's a whole lot of elements to it. The first is, and probably the most important, and this is something I kind of always harp on, but I feel like it does get underdone, is you really want to have your IT staff trained in whatever cloud provider you're using. Ideally as close to the migration as they possibly can. This is a little bit easier now because I think it's easier to find people with cloud experience as the cloud has become more mature. But I still come across a lot of configurations that were just not following best practices because it was fairly obvious to me that an engineer, maybe knew his or her stuff in an on-premises world, but they just tried to translate that directly to the cloud. And honestly, a lot of what we're going to talk about is that's where the kind of falls and places you can kind of mess up is by just taking everything you have on premises and moving to the cloud and not even thinking about any of the changes you make. One of the things you need to think about is a cloud migration strategy is really an overarching plan that outlines your organization's assets. This can be things like services, databases, IT resources like networking, and applications. And those are typically going to go from an on-premises data center or a colo, which is a data center that you lease, into a cloud-based environment. They're not necessarily fundamentally different, and you can even do like-for-like migrations. One of the options that is out there in the world is VMware runs on every cloud. And this is the answer to this question when the CXO, and I've seen this migration happen too, wants to move to the cloud ASAP for, either there's a data center lease up or there's some political reason why they have to move quickly. They'll just go VMware because they don't have to train their engineers. Great idea, but it comes at a cost, and it kind of boxes you in because it is a fully kind of baked in a non-cloud cloud solution, if that makes sense. In some cases, we have organizations that do partial moves to the cloud. They'll move some new systems. They'll keep some legacy systems on-prem. Typically, that's going to happen either in larger organizations that are just very large or organizations that gained through acquisition. We have a couple of customers that have some assets and data centers that they own because those assets are tied and there are contracts in place, or they just have challenges around moving the data. In one case, it's 100 terabytes of data in a data center that doesn't have the best internet connectivity to get to a cloud. For businesses that are thinking and still about going to the cloud and haven't been, there are several pivotal factors that you can confer. You need to have a clear roadmap. So think about that training, and you want to start thinking about how you can leverage some of the opportunities in automation things that come in the cloud. Because when you just move all of your existing assets to the cloud, for example, if you go into that VMware solution, that's easy and simple to execute. This is what happens. I always joke. There is this problem in the cloud, and it's not really a problem. It's as much as it's a psychological issue called the one bill problem. And it always happens the first month you get the cloud bill when everything's been moved to production. Uh, in the past, when you were in an on-premises world, especially maybe if you were in a colo, you paid the co-location facility, you paid your storage vendor, you paid your server vendor, you paid your hypervisor provider, you paid all of these companies independently, and they're all, for the most part, separate companies. There are ways, obviously, through resellers that you can get all that stuff on one bill, but in a lot of cases, especially for large orgs, it was all spread out. So even different managers or directors might have been responsible for those bills. When you get the cloud, so when you're with AWS, Google, or Microsoft, it's all one bill. All that stuff is on one bill, and this can cause a great deal of freak out, especially if the engineers and architects who help plan the migration didn't make this very clear to the executives that are signing the bill that they wanted to do that. There are ways to offload that, and we're going to talk through that throughout this session. But one of the things I want to mention, just because it is the most important cost savings bit up front, if you're doing a cloud migration, the single best thing you can do to reduce your cost is to either buy reserved instances, which is where you make a reservation of 1 or 3 years for a cloud resource, or get enrolled in the savings plans that the cloud providers have. The savings plans require a similar commit to the reservations. They just tend to be a little bit more flexible, although the discounts are a little bit lower. Where you might decide this is if you know you're going to be running a big SAP HANA server that's going to run for the next 3 years because you don't anticipate getting off of it. Obviously, you might want to reserve that to maximize your discounts. These discounts are big. We're talking on the order of 30 to 70%. Once you factor in those reservations, the cost in the cloud appear a lot, or savings plans, the cost in the cloud appear to be a lot better than if you're just running the baseline numbers. So it's really, really important to do this. Also, if you're using Microsoft Azure, the other thing you should note, those Windows and SQL Server licenses you own, those can be brought forth to the cloud and reduce the cost of your cloud bill as well. Obviously, you've paid for those licenses. And generally speaking, in that Microsoft landscape with SQL and Windows Server, if you know you're going to have those licenses over 3 years, they will pay for themselves as opposed to the cost of leasing those licenses from Microsoft. Unfortunately, Microsoft doesn't have this in any other cloud, so they've kind of taken their competitive advantage there. There are a number of other ways you'll hear about around reducing cloud bills. One of the more common ones, by the way, these are all second tier to those savings plans and reservations. You do want to watch your data egress charges because that's something that can add up very quickly, and it's something you didn't pay for on-prem. You want to pay attention to storage tiering, and if you can automate that, especially if you have to keep a lot of data for a long time for regulatory reasons. But in general, those reservations are going to be the biggest thing in terms of your cost reduction. Don't get me wrong, it's important to, if you can, power off VMs and scale down web servers and things like that. But those, generally speaking, aren't the source of the biggest cost savings that we see for our customers. So we talked a little bit about lift and shift, and you'll hear a lot of people be really down on lift and shift. And I'm not completely against doing lift and shift because every organization has to start somewhere. and you're not going to suddenly rebuild all of your production applications in like Kubernetes because a bunch of developers said it was cool. Uh, and more than likely, unless you're a software company, a lot of the software you're buying comes from third-party vendors. So you have to run it in VMs because it's the only way they support you running. So don't worry about that. But it's really expensive, and that's really the main concern. It's not nearly as expensive if you get the reservations and service plans right, but there are a few things to consider. If you have to have very large VMs to support very large workloads, and you do maintain an on-premises environment still, and you plan on that, it may be worthwhile to consider keeping those workloads on-prem, just because very large VMs in the cloud tend to be pretty expensive. And those VMs can go to absurd scale in both AWS and Azure. I don't know Google Cloud as well, but there's 416 core VMs that have 12 terabytes of RAM, so you can get all the compute you possibly need. But it still may be more cost effective to keep some very large workloads on prem, especially if you are planning on maintaining that on premises presence. It doesn't make sense necessarily to have all of your workloads, say, in AWS, and then have rent data center space to keep two expensive servers running, because the cost offset's probably not going to cover that. The second part of this is your workloads aren't built with the cloud in mind, and opportunities for cost reductions or even automation are limited. I don't think this is necessarily terrible. You'll start to kind of organically, and almost every customer that I've done a cloud migration for will start to organically take advantage of some of the cloud integrations, whether it's infrastructure as code for their applications, or some of the automation features, or some of the storage features that can be used to back up data. They'll start to gradually adapt, and they may still have a large number of VMs in their environment, but they'll become a more cloud native. And the term cloud native can be tied back to Kubernetes. I'm using it specifically as it relates to the public clouds themselves, and taking advantage of some of the features and services there to either reduce cost or give overall productivity gains. The final bullet on this slide, and is an important thing to remember: your existing applications do carry their existing problems into the cloud. And there are a couple of things you should consider there. And I don't want to go too deep into the technical weeds because this is a strategic talk, but I will tell you at a high level, one of the places we see the most problems is companies that move very latency sensitive workloads from very fast on-premises storage SANs, basically. So, something that's like an all-flash storage array, and move that into the cloud. The storage performance in the cloud is very good now, and you can get close to those all-flash arrays on-prem, but it's still not, it's network attached storage, so it's not directly fiber channel attached, and you just may experience more latency. So if you have applications that perform poorly on-prem, they're probably going to perform poorly in the cloud. They may actually perform a little bit worse unless you do some optimization. So keep that in mind. So are you saying we should stay on premises like the Ruby guy who drives race cars? If you're not familiar, the gentleman who founded Ruby has a company called 37 Signals, and he's made a big deal about how they're saving millions upon millions of dollars by leaving AWS and running their own data center. I bought this server for $50,000, and it can run all of my, it can replace $500,000 worth of AWS cost. That's great, and that is true by all means, but it also, to me, represents a terrible understanding of the value that the cloud can deliver for your business. There are times when I think it absolutely makes sense to go on premises. We have a customer right now who they're about a $500 million a year business in terms of revenue, and they're a heavy cloud customer of one of the public clouds, and they're really tied into a lot of their services. And I personally feel like they would be better served if they ran their own data center, potentially, for the amount of spend that they have. I think the cost could be reduced. But more importantly, it gives them more control as it relates to their business. And one of the things I like to ask is, do you have more than 10,000 servers? You can maybe start this number at 1,000. If you don't have more than 1,000, you're probably better served in the cloud. But I like to go back to my time working at Comcast and think about, if I have 10,000 or more servers, then yeah, I also probably have pretty efficient data center operations. Like when I worked at Comcast, the way we bought servers was in a reverse auction process. So we would specify a server spec, we want this many cores and this much RAM, and we'll buy 1,000 of those servers at a time, and we would send that spec out to the vendors, and they'd come up with a bid, and we'd compare those bids, and we'd buy them from the lowest cost provider. If you're doing things like that and you're really efficient at purchasing, maybe you should stay on-prem, at least for a lot of your workloads. The cloud, one of the things, I think the main thing you're paying for in the cloud is flexibility and kind of availability. We'll talk more about what those specific value propositions are later in this talk, but those are, to me, the two main things you're paying for. But I would also add, are your data centers operating effectively? Do you have, best-in-class security, or at least security that meets the needs of your both insurance and regulatory requirements? Do you anticipate rapid growth? One of the things that you'll see a lot in these cloud repatriation stories is it's some startup company. If you're a startup, it makes no sense to buy servers, right? You're trying to preserve cash. So going all in an operational expense manner where you go all in on cloud makes a whole lot of sense. You're also building a minimum viable product. You don't want to wait for hardware to arrive. You just want to scale up. However, if your startup becomes really successful and has a ton of users overnight, those cloud costs can grow because they're directly tied to your business. And that's the place where it can start to make sense as you experience that rapid growth and you're a compute dependent business. That's where it can make sense to maybe get out of the cloud. However, that's really hard because you have to, if you're doing that, and your IT organization was mainly just developers who are used to interacting with the cloud, you at this point need to either hire consultants or hire data center engineers to maybe not help you build a data center, but spec out a colo that you can lease in, get that stuff up to speed. You have to start dealing with network things that you didn't necessarily have to deal with in the cloud. It's just it's just a big challenge. It can make complete financial sense. So I definitely think there are organizations for which moving back from the cloud into on-prem can make sense. Just know it's going to take a lot of engineering. One of the other advantages of the cloud is that everything is API driven. So every service, launch, whatever, is all backed by or fronted by an API. So you can build a lot of automation and automatic scaling into your workloads. And that's something that doesn't necessarily happen on-prem. If you're using a virtualization provider like VMware or Hyper-V or one of the open source virtualization solutions, there are ways, and there are third-party tools and even native tools that can help you do that level of automation. But it's not as easy to do, and it's not one thing. And to be honest with you, if you're trying to hire people who've worked with it, I think it's easier to find folks who have worked with the cloud resources. So to put on my architect hat, this does kind of take us back to what we want to think about when we're doing a migration, or even if we're making decisions about keeping things on-prem. And the first is, are you migrating legacy systems? Or are you building a new service? And there are some questions to keep in mind here, and we'll kind of walk through them. But the last one on this slide that I have is, are you trying to design a better architecture for an existing application? There are a number of different reasons why you might make a cloud or on-prem decision, but some of the reasons why you might make a cloud decision here are if you want to take advantage of features that are only available in the cloud. One of the things that I've always found interesting about cloud computing is I've been in IT for about 25 years now. And I can tell you, in my early days of IT, if you were a small organization, you just didn't have access to things like load balancing, data centers in different parts of the country or even world. Those were things that were all challenging. In the cloud, you have these options, some like intelligent security systems that can help you. You have regional footprints all over the globe, and high availability resiliency features that are easy to implement, that don't require necessarily engineering help. Those are some really nice things that you can get benefits from. One of the other ways you can take advantage of the cloud and potentially reduce your compute cost, and this kind of ties back into AWS's origin story. If you're in any sort of a retail environment, you can use the on-demand nature of the cloud to meet peak or seasonal requirements. So you can scale up as you need it and then scale back down, which is kind of how AWS started, because Amazon had a lot of excess capacity for the holidays and they were able to sell off that capacity. If you want to retire your on-premises infrastructure, this is something we've run into with one of our customers that did a cloud migration where all of their hardware was out of date because they hadn't really been keeping up with it. So what happened was the cost of their replacing all of their hardware at once was going to be much more than migrating to the cloud. So they elected to do the cloud migration. Reduce hardware data center management cost. One of the kind of interesting things stories I've heard recently on a podcast was about a governmental organization who moved their mainframe into AWS. Main reason why they moved their mainframe into AWS, and yes, apparently you can get a mainframe in the cloud. I was not aware of that either at the time. Is that it had a huge data center footprint in terms of the physical space taken up in the data center, and they just wanted to get it out of the data center to reduce those costs. Other things are adding new capacities. So if you're looking at adding AI or machine learning to an existing application, you may need to get that compute that you don't necessarily have access to in your data center. But the main thing you want to do is narrow down each of the business requirements that are driving you towards these decisions before you start those workloads. Moving to the cloud introduces a model of shared responsibility. You've probably seen this slide before, but I always like to share it. And I always like to talk about it in the context of the 2018 Spectre and Meltdown patches, because I think it's a really interesting and easy way to talk about it. When those patches happened, I'm going to specifically talk about Microsoft Azure because it is where I do most of my work and where I live in the cloud. If you are on premises, and if you don't remember, Spectre and Meltdown were these CPU vulnerabilities that Intel announced in 2018. Pretty bad. Speculative execution, customers, an attacker could potentially run arbitrary code. If you're on-prem, you had to patch the BIOS of your servers, your physical servers. So that means somebody had to touch each server, at least virtually. You also had to patch your hypervisor. So if you're running VMware or Hyper-V, you had to patch that. You then had to patch your individual VMs at the operating system level. And potentially you had to patch software underneath that. So maybe a database system that also needed to be patched. You probably had to patch your mouse and your toaster as well. If you're running infrastructure as a service, and when we speak about infrastructure as a service, we generally refer to virtual machines, virtual networking, and storage. In this case, the only thing you really had to worry about was your virtual machines. And Microsoft sent an email to Azure customers at 2 a.m. the night the patch was announced and said, we rebooted everything because of our infrastructure, because of this patch. Your machine may have experienced a brief downtime. You still need to patch your operating system and then any machines, any services that also need patching. Platform as a service customers, so like if you're running Microsoft's Azure SQL, which is a database as a service offering, you didn't even get an email. So what happened was transparently behind the scenes, it was patched. Those services have built-in high availability, which we'll talk about on the next slide. And it just kind of happened. Same thing for software as a service. So if you're running Office 365 or Salesforce, hopefully you didn't have any exposure to these patches. And that's kind of the main difference. And I think that's a good example of all the things you're responsible for that you don't have to think about in a cloud world. Even just eliminating that virtualization, servers, storage, and networking is a great deal of management overhead that you just don't have in the cloud world. So I do always like to talk about what the value proposition is. And I do like to break this down into IaaS and PaaS, because Software as a service, while it's cloud, it isn't really cloud in the way most organizations think about it. One of the values to me, and I'm going to start with the IaaS bullets here, is nearly infinite storage and compute. This was tested a bit during the pandemic as a lot of organizations were migrated to the cloud, and there were some shortages around compute. But for the most part, you could always find enough compute to land your workload in a cloud environment. Storage, I've never run into this. It is basically infinite. I was working at a software vendor one time, and we were testing out various VM configurations. And I allocated a petabyte of storage to us, or nearly a petabyte of storage to a single VM in like 10 minutes. Imagine trying to do that on-prem. And I know storage has gotten cheaper and more efficient and all those things, but still getting a petabyte of storage is a challenge. One of the things that I run into a lot with customers that I still see on-prem and using virtualization solutions is I see a lot of VM solutions that are over-provisioned, where maybe they'll have more VMs than CPUs and things like that. Memory being oversubscribed. In the cloud, you have the opposite. So because of the service level guarantees that the cloud providers give you, they have to have enough spare resource capacity to fail you over in the event of hardware failure, in the event of any of those things. So you get VM level with IaaS, high availability. This doesn't mean you have the base level of SLA is typically 99.9. You're not protected from OS failures. You're not protected from database failures. But if anything physical goes wrong, you're in good shape. In those uptimes, if you look at the actual uptime numbers from the cloud providers, are really good. I will caveat that by saying when they go down, they typically go down for a while. But it's rarer that IaaS services go down. And generally speaking, their uptime numbers are exceedingly high. The other benefit I like to talk about on the IaaS side is virtual networking. And I know virtual networking does exist in the on-premises world with things like VNX. But this is something that can help drive automation because you're no longer having to physically touch another layer. It just becomes part of your code. It also makes it easier to do some security things like subnet segregation so that it's harder for attackers to move laterally within your network. And that's something that's, to me, valuable. I think networking is something we probably under credit in the cloud. There's a lot of networking assets around load balancing and DNS floating and things like that would be genuinely hard to do on-prem or cost a lot of money. And in a lot of cases, they're like included in the baseline service cost of the cloud. That's not something that I think we talk about enough. Platform as a service. So there's a big push, and in a lot of cases, this makes sense from the cloud providers for organizations to use more platform as a service offerings. They are definitely stickier services. They tend to be harder to migrate away from. So keep that in mind. I'm not saying vendor lock-in is a bad thing because it's not inherently, but there are some concerns there. One of the things I'll caveat platform as a service with is it's important to understand how important the service you're moving to a platform as a service offering is to your business. I have two different customers, two different clouds. I'm not going to name them, but the clouds even. But they're both very data-centric businesses. They have both moved their database platforms to database as a service offerings. They have both been exceedingly unhappy because the trade-off with PaaS always is that you give up a little bit of control for the benefits that we'll talk about in a second. If the asset you're moving to the cloud is that critical to your business, you may want to keep it in IaaS so you have a greater level of control over it. The other thing I'll tell you is that PaaS services are highly variable. I tried to highlight some of the common tenets between them, but they don't all work the same way. VMs pretty much all work the same way. If you've used a VM in VMware, you've used a VM in Azure, you've used a VM in Amazon. The only thing that's really different is the storage works a little bit differently. But the VMs themselves are pretty much the same. Platform as a service databases or services in general are all over the map in terms of pricing, in terms of what they offer and how things work. So it's really important to ask a lot of questions around the specifics of those services, especially if it's something that's of critical importance to your business. There are some of the services that are fantastic, and I would always recommend, like the web server as a service offerings from Azure and AWS are great, but you really want to understand them. There are some general common architectural tenets around platform as a service offerings that I wanted to highlight. Typically, they have built-in service level high availability. This goes a step further than the infrastructure as a service solutions in that they're typically designed to tolerate OS failure, or like in the case of a database, if the database engine fails, they'll survive that gracefully and have minimums of downtime in the event of one of those failures. Backups are typically handled by the system, so you don't have to worry about backups. In most cases, I've seen a couple of database service or data services that don't necessarily have backups, and it is important to understand what your recovery point is for those backups. So good benefit of the service, but you want to understand it and what your needs are. Automated patching. This is probably the best one. These just work. You get updates and you don't think about it. Likewise, you get evergreen versions of software in a lot of cases. The software gets patched, you get new features, you don't have to worry about deploying any code. The features are just there. DR is typically available. So when we talk about high availability versus disaster recovery, for cloud purposes, and in most cases in general, I'm going to refer to high availability being something that's within a single data center, or at least within a single region. Disaster recovery is typically something that spans regions. And in most cases, platform as a service offerings will allow you to have a secondary region, but you do pay for that. The high availability is built in. I've tried to emphasize this enough. You really don't want to just blindly adopt a platform as a service offering because your Microsoft or Amazon sales rep told you it was the best thing since sliced bread. Have your engineers evaluate the service, talk to other customers, especially for something that's critical to your business. For an application that maybe you don't care about as much and isn't that important, and you just want to not have to worry about it, they're almost universally better than trying to manage them yourselves. When you get to those business criticality places, that's where you want to be really careful with using platforms as a service offerings. And I'm not saying not to use them, because in a lot of cases they're still good there, but you want to understand what they are and how they work. One of the things that annoys me about cloud vendors, and I guess it shouldn't annoy me, but it does, is the cloud vendors tend to think people like variable price services. And I think cloud vendors like them because the upside of variable price services leads to their stock price going up, and they're paid largely in stock. But that's just my perception. It's important to understand how the services you pay for are costed. For the most part, this is a place where infrastructure as a service is really straightforward. A VM costs X dollars a month. Storage costs Y dollars per terabyte per month. Network traffic costs Z dollars per gigabyte per month, or Z cents per gigabyte per month, more likely. If your VM is at 100% CPU the entire month, if you're constantly reading that storage, there are no additional costs. So that's something that's really important to understand. Platform as a service offerings, on the other hand, many of them have auto scaling, which means you lead to these fixed costs. And this is a slide with a chart that talks about how you can see an abstraction. If we have auto scaling, the orange line at the top is if we don't have any auto scaling on. So our costs are fixed. Whereas if we have automatic scaling or serverless options, those things can scale. It's important to understand what those pricing models are. In a lot of cases, serverless options will auto pause and stop and not charge you at all, but their per second cost can be higher. So it's important to understand that if you have things that you can only do by consumption, you really want to understand and monitor, and you can monitor that through the API, what that pricing looks like. And if you're going to blow out your budget, there are typically ways you can, pay in advance in full for dedicated capacity. So monitoring those budget things are definitely, if you're not doing it yourself as a technology leader, you may want to have engineering staff dedicated to it. This has become a whole practice with FinOps, but it is something to understand. Likewise, performance efficiency. One of the things that I hearken back about cloud, and I've been good in being able to convince customers of not making the same mistake. But when I worked with in the early days of virtualization, one of the things I saw was I would be managing a database server that would have 8 cores and 128 gig of RAM, and the VM engineers like, I saw your server had 8 cores and 128 gigs, so I gave you 4 virtual cores and 32 gig of RAM. Is that going to be good? Don't ever do that. Like, if you're moving my VM workloads, migrate them like for like. In some cases, you may need to over allocate, especially on the storage performance end, but don't try to save money by cutting resources, at least at first. If you get those resources into the cloud and you can see they're not being utilized, then by all means consider reducing the amount of resources that are allocated to those workloads. But when you're doing your initial migration, you want to keep everything the same. The kind of interesting thing about this slide, so the first just shows if we allocated compute to meet our peak needs. So this would typically be something that's running in a VM where we don't really have any choices about how we in a monolithic VM where we only have one and we have the option to size it big to meet the need or go slow. The second option, where we're having some performance issues, can be kind of an interesting solution, because if that's a batch workload, let's say that's a payroll operation that has to complete between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. and it's having performance issues and it's maxing out the server at night, but that workload completes at 4 a.m. We don't really care. It doesn't need to complete at 2 a.m. As long as it's completing by 6 a.m., that's our goal. And then finally, the last model is like an auto scale model. And these can be the most cost-effective ways to support workloads that support it. Some good examples of this are web servers, anything that's stateless, but web servers where you can gradually add instances as workload goes up, and then gradually subtract instances as workload goes down. Auto scaling is awesome, and it is one of the benefits of the cloud. It's very easy to have auto scaling, but it's important to pay attention to because it's also something that can get quite expensive. Especially at scale, one of the things you should really think about doing is automating as much as you can. It reduces errors. We like to use the term click ops for people who deploy things in the portal. And believe me, I do a lot of click ops, but I'm building at demo environments, and I'm not necessarily building applications at scale. You can take advantage of things like source control. There are tools like Terraform, and the cloud providers have their own native scripting capabilities. And this just reduces the human element of errors into your operational activities. So being able to automate that is something that's a really cool benefit of the cloud, and it's something you should take advantage of, especially for larger environments where you don't want to make mistakes and maybe choose the wrong VM type. Kind of a different talk, but you can also take advantage of things like policy to limit the kinds of resources that can be deployed so that you can reduce those errors that may potentially cost you lots of money. So aligning your strategy to your business goals, this is something that's really important to understand, and it's going to depend on what type of business you are. If you're a business where IT is a cost center, or you're maybe a manufacturing facility, and you're not having direct ties to the business, then you might just go for the most cost optimized solution. When I read this slide, I was thinking more of businesses whose core business is something that is tied to what's in their cloud. In general, the cloud is a lot more cost effective for the levels of availability and service that it offers for many organizations. It's just, you're going to have higher availability. You're going to have better security if you do it right. All those things are easier in the cloud. And I would argue cheaper, because engineers are not cheap. I don't know if you've tried to hire anybody lately, but they can be expensive. Many organizations, even with just going lift and shift, will kind of organically move to cloud native solutions, like taking advantage of the object storage that's in the cloud, taking advantage of some of the automation based features. taking advantage of the cloud monitoring. Any new application development is probably should probably take advantage of cloud services. And I've even seen organizations that stayed on-prem for their production resources, but did a lot of dev work in the cloud just because of the flexibility and reducing developer downtime. All of this should tie closely into your business strategy. I mentioned the different types of companies that are cloud users, but really, if your cloud workloads are driving your business and your sales, that's where you can really start to pay attention. Obviously, you're probably going to have more flexibility and more budget because your cloud costs are directly tied to your sales. So it is important to align the strategy to your business. Like if you're in a cost center space, you're just going to try to reduce costs as much as possible. If you're driving the business, you're still going to try to optimize costs, but you might optimize for user experience, for example. So some business guidelines are about the cloud. I was just in a meeting the other day with one of my clients, and they're about I think I mentioned them earlier. They're about a $500 million a year business, and they were looking at migrating a service, a very complex service migration. I'll say, don't want to get into too many details, and they were going to save $3 million a year on 500 million, right? Which is, if you do the math, I think that's like 1/125th. So it's 0.006%. So not a whole lot of savings to be gained there relative to the business, even though $3 million sounds like a lot. But the cost difference is there. $3 million is 7 to 8 engineers, salary plus benefits, plus everything else you'd have to spend on bringing engineers up to speed. So that's not, everybody would like to have 7 more engineers, but that's also, is it really worth doing that migration and doing the risk that it entails? So if you're just doing a like for like across cloud providers, maybe that's a little bit easier, but this was a whole platform shift. So that's something that could be a big challenge. Those migrations are hard. I've done so many, so you want to plan carefully and think strategically. Multi-cloud will probably happen to you organically, especially if you're a large organization. It's too hard to manage everybody in that organization, and there's enough people and enough branch divisions that have spending authority that you're probably going to end up being multi-cloud. You're not necessarily designing multi-cloud apps, but you are having to manage multiple clouds and multiple cloud vendors. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're managing this going forward. Even if you're on premises, you're probably going to end up being multi-cloud in a large org. And then finally, the cloud delivers really good availability, and meeting those availability levels will cost more than you think it does. To conclude, using the cloud is both technology and a business strategy. You're changing the way you spend money and things you have to think about. Understanding the complete value proposition of IT has always been a challenge, and it is a challenge. And understanding the value provided by the cloud is something that is also difficult. And a lot of organizations can lose sight from this because maybe they saw a podcast from, the Ruby guy who talked about how great moving back to on-prem was. Understanding that total value proposition is challenging. And I think on-premises is still a great fit for a lot of workloads, especially high-end or persistent workloads. But it's not for everybody or every organization. So keep that in mind as you're going through this, and think about things holistically. Think about the engineering staff you have, because if you're having to go back and build that data center capacity, those people are harder and harder to find, and probably more and more expensive. If you have that capacity, it can become a little bit easier to stay on-prem. Well, with that, Keith, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do, Joey. First of all, I wanted to thank you for that awesome presentation. I'm definitely older than you. Let me start off by saying, and I remember the days back in my brief time in IT when IT was simply seen as a loss leader, right? A cost center. Mm-hmm. There was no alignment between business objectives, business goals, and IT at all. IT was something you had to have, you had to pay for, and that was about it. So these kinds of things are are not new discussions, but there was a time when these weren't even discussions at all. So I really appreciate the overview and the new alignment that you're talking about. And we have some great questions. You were so thorough that we don't have time for a ton of questions, but let's get into some of the most interesting ones I think that came in. So first one for you today, Joey. What are some of the biggest mistakes companies make when deciding to move into the public cloud? And you can that's open ended. You can answer that however you'd like.
Great question. I think there are a few mistakes that I see companies make. There are technical mistakes and there are strategic mistakes. And I think the strategic mistakes are just simply not getting their staff up to speed enough on the cloud. And that's either through formal training or informal training. But it is very different. And I like to break down where those differences are. And that gets us to those technical mistakes. Security, networking, and storage are all very different in the cloud from an on-prem world. Security, you have all this cloud security that is like almost like the security you had in your hypervisors, so VMware. So understanding how that works and how you're going to build out a security model is really important. Understanding that networking is really different and how you need to configure that is also something that big challenge. And then finally, understanding how cloud storage works and how to get the best performance out of it. I mentioned storage mainly because I think that's where we identify most of the performance problems that we see.
Absolutely. Okay, here's an interesting one. Who should be driving these decisions? Admins, C-level execs, both? Now, every environment, of course, is going to be different. But in your experience, Joey, have you seen or do you have any recommendations as to how this typically works best?
Ideally, the C levels will set the strategy and provide the funding, and then kind of get out of the way. Uh, where it's important, I feel like, is to have good architects. Whether you have to, and this is self-serving, but if you have to bring in consulting help, do it. But realistically, if you're making a big cloud migration, you want to hire a cloud architect or two who knows a lot. Like, you have to know, it's hard to keep up with this stuff because it changes so constantly, and you have to have a good breadth of knowledge around networking, storage, security, all of those things, and can oversee your admins and help train your admins and get them better facilitated into the process. Because it's not going to be a big leap for your admins to become cloud admins, but they're not going to become cloud architects overnight because they don't have that breadth of knowledge.
For sure. Okay. I think we have time for just a couple of more here. You talked about repatriating workloads earlier, i.e., moving workloads off of the public cloud back into a data center, back into an on-premises environment. Now, in your experience, is it always cost that drives these repatriations, or are there other factors that you've seen as well for repatriation?
I have seen both cost and performance drive those. Typically, it's cost. When it's performance, it's typically because an organization still has a pretty big on-premises presence and they're like in a hybrid environment. And they'll maybe have tested and tried a workload in the cloud. And then they'll say, we're just not seeing the performance we want. Let's move back. And 99 times out of 100, that's because they had really great storage on-prem and they just can't get that level of performance in the cloud. The cost thing's more complicated. And the really good repatriation stories that are not done irrationally, because I think there is some of that, are typically where you've had a lot of organic growth, and the cloud costs have just really become a much larger chunk than you would have expected, and you can do things more cost effectively on-prem, which does require you to be at a pretty high level of scale, but it does happen.
And I like to call it the sticker shock. You mentioned that first
Yeah,
cloud bill, right? And that that's what causes the heart palpitations and can lead to overreacting, as you say. Okay, final question here. It sounds like someone who wants maybe a little bit of free advice from you, Joey, but I'm sure you're happy to oblige in this setting.
sure.
So you can give a company one and only one piece of advice before moving to the public cloud. what do you tell them? What is the single most important thing you would
Whew.
pick to consider upfront?
Your first bill is going to be way more expensive than you think it is. Uh, no, but up front is you can never plan enough, and not just planning around the migration, just planning everything. And I know that's kind of lame because it encompasses a whole lot of options, but you really just can never plan enough, because there's so much and so much that can happen. And take advantage. And I know I'm answering your question with three answers, but take advantage of some of the free services that the cloud providers will give you, because they will. If you're doing a big migration, Microsoft or Amazon or Google will be happy to give you some free engineering help to facilitate that migration.
It's easy, I think, Joey, to get kind of swept up in trends, the trend to the cloud. A similar trend has been going on in some ways with repatriating
Mm-hmm.
workloads. And when that happens, we do tend to kind of short circuit the planning process. So I just think that is great advice. Joey, this has been so much fun to be on with you today and to learn about the business alignment in going to the cloud and the reasons why you may or may not want to. Thank you so much for your time and for dropping such great wisdom on our heads today.
Thank you very much, Keith. It was great.
Thank you so much, Joey. It is always a pleasure to be on with you to talk tech. We had some great questions today, and some outstanding information. Joey, as always, is just superb at his ability to draw from his personal experience and apply it to pretty much every scenario. So it was just a great time of learning, and I hope you learned a lot today. So that does it for the content. We have one more piece of business though before we wrap up, and that is the Amazon gift card prize drawing. As I mentioned at the beginning, for this and any Actual Tech Media event, you have to be present for the entire thing to be eligible for the prize. And the winner of today's $250 Amazon gift card is Erica Cronin from Massachusetts. Congratulations to you, Erica. We will be in touch ASAP to get you your gift card. I hope you use it on something like some good Christmas presents. And with that, everyone, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank our sponsors for making this event possible. That would be Rubrik, Do It, and Cisco Duo. And thanks to you, the attendees, always for being here, for your great questions, and for your interest that you are showing in our sponsors. I hope you all have a great day. And this concludes today's event. Go forth and do good, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.